I can't really say that guides are my usual shtick when it comes to Warframe content, but then again, I don't really have a particular focus to begin with. You know, unless you count cringe content as a focus anyways. Regardless, quite a lot of folk appreciated the Limbo guide that I did some time ago, despite the absolute horrible audio mixing and overall quality. Anywho, Limbo was a special case because the frame is so polarizing. Whereas most other frames have playstyles and builds that most of the community can agree upon. But with Limbo, I mean, no one ever explicitly said that this was a bad build. However, I have had a number of people ask, could you talk about Loki? Now, for a while, I never really saw the point, because Loki falls into that category that I was talking about before. But I do have some things that I want to talk about that folk may or may not know about Loki, similar to Limbo. So, why should you listen to the shitlord you see in front of you right now? Well, to give you the brief history, I started playing this game back in March of 2013, at least according to my forum account, and my first ever frame that I picked up was Loki, as back then he was one of the starting frames as opposed to the current choice of Excalibur, Mag, and Volt. So basically, instead of choosing between Excalibur or Loki, you now just pick Excalibur for your starter frame. Oh, what? Now, if you needed any indication of how much Loki I've played, well, my Loki Prime only just very recently overtook my regular Loki as my most played frame in terms of playtime. But it still has less total XP gain compared to my regular Loki. By the way, I've gotten rid of my regular Loki ever since I got my hands on the primed version. Not only that, but I also contributed various guides on Loki, one of which is on the wiki, though it's now quite outdated. Needless to say, I've played plenty of Loki, and I'm quite wokey. But, okay, so I figured, why not? Let's go ahead and make a Loki guide. Sure, it's been done a million times before, and sure, I could cover more relevant things and not have the channel slowly sink into the depths of irrelevancy, but here's my argument. So, that is why I'm doing this. By the way, I should note that I'm going to be going into quite a bit of technical detail relating to Loki and his abilities, most of which you don't really need to know. I just figured a lot of it is interesting, so if you're looking for builds and don't care about how much social life I sacrificed just to understand a video game, you can go ahead and skip to this time on the screen for builds. Loki is a crowd control frame with a specific focus on what I call AI manipulation. Instead of simply, say, halting enemies altogether, or slowing their speed down, Loki specializes in flipping switches in the heads of enemies to change how they behave and react. Though, this is all a very dramatic and overblown way of describing him when you could just say, he's CC. But, that is how his kit works. His decoy redirects aggro, his invisibility shuts off any aggro generation Loki might have, and Radial Disarm forces enemies to adopt melee AI, which is quite different compared to enemies with ranged weapons. Radial Disarm is especially important to understand, so that's why I'm describing it all like this. Loki's kit is capable of handling most content in the game, sans Eidolons, though he struggles with missions that require killing. He certainly isn't the worst at it though. With a good melee weapon, he can go around racking up a substantial score of kills. Hell, he's one of the best picks for missions like defense, despite the fact that mob clearing is pretty important there. We'll get into why he's so good in defense later on. However, he does need a team to clear floors in missions like defense if you want to have a decent clear pace. Loki's viability rises the higher the mission level is, and this typically applies to most CC frames in general. If a mission is so low leveled that an Ember, Equinox, Banshee, or Saren can just kill everything and have that be the CC, then Loki probably isn't going to be the best pick. However, he scales fantastically in late game missions thanks to his invisibility and radial disarm in particular. As such, Loki is at home in missions like Kuva Floods and Sorties, where his CC can take hold immediately, unlike most damage-dealing frames who begin to take longer to take out mobs. He also has amazing utility in things like Spy. He's fully capable of bypassing various different spy traps and puzzles thanks to Switch Teleport. In short, Loki is a CC frame who works best in high-level content and with a team that can clear up mobs for him whilst he does his job. He also has utility for certain missions. With all that said, let's begin by talking about his abilities. For Loki's abilities, I'm going to be going over each one individually and their unique traits, instead of just listing off his description and moving on, since that's already been done by DE themselves with their official videos. So there's no point in repeating that. Loki's first ability, Decoy, isn't talked about too often since Loki is primarily valued for his invisibility and radial disarm. However, Decoy is a useful ability despite the fact that it may be outclassed by his 4. I'm going to be getting into the inner mechanics of Decoy here, so prepare yourself for a long explanation. Decoy on its own isn't fantastic. D has not done anything to its health or defenses since release, and it certainly shows. Enemy levels have risen, and they themselves have been subjected to power creep, not just the Tenno. This means that Decoy ends up dying if a level 50 Grineer happens to fling one of their rotted fingers at it, and due to how enemy AI works, if enemies have been alerted to your presence and the Decoy dies, they're immediately going to snap back towards your sorry arse and begin shouting Grineer obscenities at you, and, you know, also try to kill you as well. However, I've not yet demonstrated why I like Decoy as an ability. This is why. So, what just happened here? It's as if the enemies just had their brains shut off. They immediately stopped attacking me. But it's weird, isn't it? The Decoy isn't within their field of view, so what's going on? This is the first of 2 reasons why Decoy is so special. Firstly, due to how enemy AI works, when they're fully aggressive, they will seek any of their aggro targets through walls and they will focus on them until they lose their aggressive state. Enemies have 3 states: passive, alerted, and aggressive. You can also check the state of each enemy on your minimap if you're running something like Enemy Sense. If the arrow is completely hollow, the enemy is passive. In this state, enemies are susceptible to stealth finishers and being added onto the stealth kill affinity multiplier. If the arrow has its middle filled in, it means that the enemy is alerted. The enemy is no longer open to stealth finishers and will reset the stealth affinity multiplier if killed, though they will not lock onto you if you come up behind them and whack them, for example. If the arrow is completely filled in, the enemy is aggressive and attacking. In this state, enemies instantly lock onto their targets within their field of view, and they will even track those targets through walls. They also gain a full 360-degree field of view, meaning that if this arrow is completely filled in, you're not going to be sneaking up on them. This last state in particular applies to Decoy, meaning that even though the Decoy is clearly not in view, they're still going to attempt to attack it, as long as they're enemies with guns. Melee AI is actually a tad smarter, which I'll get into in a second. By abusing this trait of the AI, we can effectively lock down most enemies that primarily attack with ranged weaponry, though it's not perfect and I'll explain why in a moment. However, just the fact that enemies can target us through walls isn't why Decoy is so unique. There is indeed a second part, but to explain that, we need to talk about parallel aggro priority. To put it simply, enemies are programmed to prioritize certain targets over others depending on specific factors. In normal cases, players generate a modest amount of aggro, whereas things like defense objectives generate way more. Thus, enemies are more likely to target the defense objective instead of the player. In fact, that's mainly how defense missions are programmed. Enemies spawn in, have their pathing set to get close to the defense objective, and then their aggro priority system takes over. So here's the big catch. The Decoy has just as high, if not higher, aggro generation as defense objectives. meaning that enemies will try to attack the decoy primarily, though, like mentioned before, it's not perfect. If you or anything else gets too close to an enemy, within about 6 meters from my testing, your aggro generation spikes up extremely high and that enemy will shift its focus to you. So that is why this is happening here. However, this will not work on things like infested or enemies restricted to melee. Melee enemies will indeed detect the decoy when they're aggressive, however, their AI takes a second to do a quick internal check. If they can pass the decoy to begin attacking, they will do so. However, if the decoy is, say, off a ledge and they can't get to it, melee units will actually ignore the decoy and set their aim on another target. So don't rely on decoy to break infested AI or anything hit by radial disarm. Anyways, in the case that you're running primarily an invisibility build, with something like Narrow-Minded on, you still do have a pretty solid form of crowd control with decoy, as long as you're not dealing with mostly melee units. Loki's invisibility has always been my favorite form of invisibility in the game, a bias for Loki in general aside. The main reasons for this are, it has the longest duration of any timer-based invisibility power, it's dirt cheap to cast, and, unlike things like Prowl, it doesn't restrict your actions. Nowadays, it's pretty easy to make a build where you regain all the energy used to cast invisibility, and then some, before it even wears off. Anyways, there's not too much to talk about with invisibility. You activate it, and you'll stop drawing aggro. Invisibility works well in combination with decoy if you're dealing with melee-based enemies such as infested, or if you're running a radial disarm build, just as long as the decoy is out in the open. Most folk by now know that you get a melee damage boost if you strike an enemy who is unaware of your presence, and invisibility allows for that. But, keep in mind, if an enemy isn't killed by the initial strike, you can't get another stealth melee strike for a few seconds. If you're going to be using Loki and invisibility for melee damage, make sure that you're using a weapon and an attack that does a lot of damage in a single strike. Arguably the least useful of Loki's abilities, Switch Teleport has minimal uses, though it does have some interesting ones. The hell are you doing here? Hey! Give me that, yoink! You know, I'm actually starting to feel bad. You know what? I'm gonna give this back to him. Why not? And I'll tell you what, I'll give him a present to send him on his way too for the trouble. Redemption feels good. If you're running a max-ranged radial disarm build, you also gain the ability to use Switch Teleport as a form of movement, though this is only really useful on the plains. Speaking of the plains, it can also be used to move things like escort drones ahead by a good distance. You can also use it to reposition those goddamn annoying sortie defense operatives. Another use worth mentioning is that in some cases, it's possible to teleport to allies without actually moving them. It seems to work primarily when you teleport from up in the air, and when you're not the host of the mission. I've used this to primarily catch up with allies, or to get to them immediately if they go down. You can also, of course, use it to teleport downed allies out of inconvenient areas in order to revive them, but that's pretty basic knowledge. Or you can use it to do something that DE absolutely despises: break maps. Fix it all you want, DE. I'll always manage to break it again. Switch Teleport also has a rather niche augment, but you might find some use for it. It allows you to grant anyone who Switch Teleports with you invincibility for a few seconds, and this scales off of power duration. Though, whether it's worth annoying your teammates for or not is up to you to decide. Last thing that I want to mention is that Switch Teleport's augment also works on the decoy, and because the invincibility scales off of power duration, it can actually be a viable way of making decoy last longer. But whether or not that's worth a mod slot is, again, up for you to decide, Because against Infested, it can actually be quite handy, as Decoy can be invincible for over 20 seconds with the right build. But in the case of Grineer and Corpus, it might not be worth the slot. Now we're at arguably Loki's best ability, Radial Disarm. If you've ever heard of the Loki Master Race meme, this is certainly the reason why it exists. Radial Disarm is a CC ability with one very important feature: it lasts forever. Most CCs tend to run on a timer of sorts. Radial Disarm does not. Once an enemy is affected by it, they remain affected by it until they dead. Not only that, but Radial Disarm can reach a range of 50 meters easily, and you can recast it whenever you want. So yeah, you can see how that kind of helps him out a bit. But the other thing about it is that it removes any ranged weaponry enemies might be using, and it forces them to adopt melee. This is way more important than it might sound. If you've been playing for long enough, you know just how absurd some enemies are with their damage output. Some of them will kill you far faster than you might expect, and certain enemies that just seem like common fodder can actually be devastating. For example, let me ask you a question. Who do you think will kill me faster? The dreaded heavy corrupt bombard, or one common trashy boy? Yeah, certain trash mobs can absolutely devastate you, and due to how common they can be, at higher levels they can be a gigantic pain in the ass. But removing those weapons from them makes them much easier to handle. Radial Disarm is also what makes Loki a great pick for defense. Melee AI is very simple. They pat to their preferred target in an attempt to smash their face in, while ranged AI tend to be more cautious. They tend to hang back and stay behind cover, and this usually slows down defense progress. This means that defense tends to be sped up since enemies aren't hiding behind walls as much, so mobs end up dying quicker. However, Radial Disarm can also be augmented to work better in situations where killing isn't as important. Irradiating Disarm is a fantastic upgrade to Radial Disarm, and it's also a fantastic upgrade to Nyx. But that's only if you're smart and know when to use it and when not to use it. By the way, even though the name and visual effect might give the impression that enemies become irradiated, they actually don't, at least according to the health bar here, and this also means that you unfortunately cannot use Irradiating Disarm to boost Condition Overload, so keep that in mind. Loki has 3 primary builds: invisibility focused, Radial Disarm focused, and a hybrid of both. Each have their own focus and uses. Invisibility builds tend to be useful for things like spy and rescue, especially when combined with decoy and switch teleport shenanigans, whereas Radial Disarm is at home with things like defense, survival, mobile defense, excavation, interception, and a few others. With that said, here are my builds. The invisibility build consists primarily of boosting duration as high as it can go. Efficiency, range, and strength are all not very important. Efficiency doesn't need to be too high because it's quite easy to regain all the energy you use via means like Energy Siphon and or Zenuric Energy Bubble. Range, at least for a pure invisibility build and not a hybrid, also is not important. Your main tools with an invisibility build will be, of course, invisibility, but also Decoy, which has a fixed cast range that isn't affected by power range anyways. Strength obviously doesn't affect Loki at all outside of the minuscule damage that Radial Disarm can do to Infested, but it's so minor that you might as well not even bother. You might notice that I don't have Vitality on this build, and honestly I don't use Vitality on any other build either, and the reason for that is twofold. 1, you shouldn't be getting hit with either an Invisibility Loki or a Radial Disarm Loki. And 2, I use Quick Thinking in place of Vitality anyways. Loki has very low base HP and even lower armor in general, so Vitality isn't going to help him as much in any build. The main focus that you should have is just not letting yourself get hit at all. he has the tools needed for that too, so that's why Vitality is absent from all my builds. The only real things that should end up killing you is the occasional super strong slash proc or toxin proc, and in those cases, quick thinking is there to prevent those from killing you. You'll also notice that there's 2 free slots in this build, and the reason for that is that they're honestly free slots. You can use your Exilus slot for something like Coaction Drift, Enemy Sense, Pain Threshold, Rush, Thieves' Wit, or, I don't know, Warm Coat? I typically swap the Exilus mod around every now and then, and sometimes I'll bring Enemy Sense, other times Thieves' Wit, and a few others. Honestly, it really doesn't matter what you use here, it's up to you. The second slot, again, doesn't matter too much either. I'll often use an augment in this slot just for the hell of it, because Loki is one of those few frames who honestly does have spare mod slots, because he can completely ignore certain stats like power strength entirely, meaning he doesn't have to counterbalance negatives. So honestly, just go wild here once you have the basics down. Don't you just love that beautiful 40% strength? Once again, you can ignore quite a few stats. In Radial Disarm's case, duration and strength. Though, it would be nice not to go too far down with duration. It is still nice to have decent access to invisibility even if you're not completely built for it. So that's why I have Prime Continuity here. But you can feel free to take it off if you want a completely pure Radial Disarm build. Natural Talent, by the way, is an absolute must here. The cast time for Radial Disarm is quite long, so make sure that you throw this on. Fleeting Expertise and Streamline basically mean that you can throw out map-wide CCs with reckless abandon. And of course, you're also going to want a lot of range, and you actually have a few options here as well. I personally stick to 250% using Cunning Drift, Stretch, and Overextended. Though you can get higher. You could replace one of these mods with Augur Reach, for example. This build also gives you access to long-distance switch teleporting, so I usually bring this along for Plains of Eidolon bounties and the like, because not only does it help get around, but you'll also be using it to speed up drone progress, and of course, you'll have access to Radial Disarm, which is going to be used to defend terminals. This build is basically the RD build, but sacrificing efficiency to have some more duration. This allows for better use of the rest of his kit, though you will have to monitor your energy a bit more. Speaking of which, I don't actually have my Loki Prime Formud, but if I did, I'd be able to use Prime Flow instead of regular flow here. So if you're able, do use Prime Flow because there's not much reason not to. This could very well be a one-size-fits-all sort of build. I've heard of plenty of people who just run a hybrid build and don't bother with making builds specifically for invisibility and Radial Disarm. And honestly, I can see why. The game has made it much easier over time to ignore things like power efficiency, so if you don't mind the extra energy costs for powers, there isn't much reason to not run a hybrid all day every day. Though, for me personally, I switch between them all as I see fit. I've gotten too used to decoy and invisibility lasting for 90 years, and my Radial Disarm build only costing like 20 energy. When you're rolling invisibility, Loki, and trying to bash everything to death with your meme Zaw, keep in mind a few things. Firstly, like mentioned before, you're best off going for attacks that deal a lot of damage in a single strike. Second, make sure that you're spacing your melee appropriately. If you bump into a target, you'll actually lose your ability to land a stealth hit on them and you'll have to wait a few seconds. So what's funny is that you actually don't want to be using stealthy daggers or concealable fist weapons ideally. You actually want to be using giant pole arms and huge anime swords. Or the Glaive Prime. Glaive Prime is goddamn amazing. Speaking of melee recommendations, Loki works extremely well with the Zenistar if you have access to it. The radial effect here is affected by stealth multipliers, so Loki can honestly lock down a point with nothing but a really strong Zenistar in his invisibility damage boost. Bonus points if you have a Riven. When you're using Radial Disarm, even though you can spam it a lot, Give yourself a few seconds before recasting because enemies affected by Radial Disarm are stunned for about 2 seconds and they will not move. And this stun will apply to enemies that are already affected by Radial Disarm in the first place. If you're doing defense, constantly spamming Radial Disarm will just slow down enemy flow and impede mission progress. So, you know, don't do it. Additionally, avoid using Irradiating Disarm in missions like defense because this will prevent enemies from pathing to the objective and killing them will just become harder. The same rule applies to things like excavation. And that's about all I got. I'm really hoping that this wasn't just like every other Loki guide you could pull up on Google, because, like I said before, Loki isn't nearly as complicated as a frame like Limbo. All you really need to know is, make a build for invisibility and Radial Disarm. That's it. But I wanted to get into more technical detail involving things like decoy and how enemy AI interacts with Loki's abilities. It has been 5 years. 5 years, and I still play this glorious Hammerhead man. He, along with frames like Rhino, seem to show no age in their design. 5 years, and he's still one of the best, if not the best, CC'er in the game. 5 years, and he still has the best prime design. Fight me! Come on, I'll take all of you! I'll take all— And now, I'm gonna delete him and start playing Nyx.